Pittsburgh is a city where the past, present, and future collide, and I truly mean that. It's hard to think about, but all three of those things are happening in Pittsburgh. More importantly, it is a city of innovation, risk-taking, and resilience. I came to learn about Pittsburgh through a research initiative with economists from Purdue Northwest, Indiana University Northwest, Valparaiso University, and Center for Workforce Innovations, and I know Mark and Ben touched on this briefly. As One Region's mission is to grow population, attract and retain talent, we looked at places in the country with a turnaround story and attracting young professionals, which just so happens to be the millennial demographic. The reason we picked millennials is because there are three ways to grow a population. One is immigration, the second is net migration, and the third is increased birth rates. Millennials are the largest population segment, and they are starting families. You can see information again about this effort on the back of the one-pager. And as Mark said, we are leading trips to each of the places that we learned about. We focused on 3 places. It ended up being Hoboken, New Jersey, and Jersey City because of the bi-state relationship with New York City, Pittsburgh because of the history in steel manufacturing, and Denver for Denver's investments in infrastructure, which is what we are embarking upon with the investments in the South Shore train and transit-oriented development. Over the past 10 years, Pittsburgh's young adult population grew by 8%, while our region remains stagnant, which is a threat to our prosperity. As Pittsburgh economy transformed, the city changed its focus. It began creating amenities to attract people who would bring innovation and business growth to a once struggling community. As Mayor Murphy will share, Pittsburgh lost 40% of its population, if not more, from 1970 to 2006. Our story is not different. In 1970, the population of Hammond and Gary combined was 277,000 people. Today, the estimated population of both combined is 153,000. That's a 45% decline. Many people in Pittsburgh attribute the city's success to Murphy's leadership, his vision, the partnerships he created, and his ability to manage conflict. Murphy followed the adage, if you build it, they will come. Pittsburgh truly is a field of dreams. A study conducted by Pew Charitable Trust concluded that the young adult population in Pittsburgh grew as a result of the following factors: the close collaboration between the private sector and higher education institutions, a thriving tech-based economy, a relatively low cost of living, a rich cultural environment, an outstanding food and drink scene, and the overall quality of life. Pittsburgh is different from Northwest Indiana. I don't want to deny that. Every place is different than Northwest Indiana, which means that we are authentic. But there are certainly things that we can learn from Pittsburgh. So at this time, I would like to welcome Tom Murphy to share with you his story.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. Why are 630 people here for lunch? Is it a good lunch? Is the food well known here? Why are you here? You're here because you're trying to figure out what the future is for Northern Indiana. And you think maybe the story of Pittsburgh could help. And I'd like to think maybe it can, but you need to define your own story. And what I'm going to give you is I work for a group since leaving as mayor called the Urban Land Institute. It's actually going to be doing some work in Gary, Indiana in early next year. And it's given me an opportunity to travel all over the world. So I've had this opportunity to see what's going on in the world today. I've been in 70 cities in the last year. And what I've learned, the one lesson I've learned, whether it's Hong Kong or Gary, Indiana, or Pittsburgh or Lafayette, Louisiana, every city in the world is trying to figure out their place of where they fit in because the rules are fundamentally changing. And that will not happen by accident. It will happen because you are very intentional about what you want to be. You were one thing, just like Pittsburgh. We were both one thing. We were a place where steel was made, and now we're not. And so we got to become something else, and that something else is about being intentional. And I want to give you a history lesson for a moment, or test you. How many of you know who Horatio Nelson Jackson is? Raise your hand. Not one person. You fail American history. He came through here. He changed your life, and you don't remember him. So Horatio Nelson Jackson was a doctor in Vermont, and he was out to dinner with a group of other doctors, and they were debating in San Francisco, they were at a medical convention, and they were debating the impact of the automobile in American society. And all those doctors, as smart as they were, thought it was really going to be a toy for the rich. Wasn't going to have much impact at all. And Horatio thought it was a game changer. And he bet them all $50 that night he could drive across the United States in 90 days. And they all laughed and took the bet. And the very next day, Horatio went and bought his first car. He convinced the young mechanic, Sewall Crocker, to go with him. For whatever reasons that day, they bought a dog named Bud. And the very next day, with no maps to speak of and no support, Horatio, Sewall, and Bud are driving across the United States. It was 1903. In 1903, there were 8,000 cars in America, 150 miles of paved road, and no highway department in any state. 63 days later, Horatio, Sewall, and Bud drove down Fifth Avenue in New York City. They were the first people to drive across the United States. That was in 1903. By 1923, there were 10 million cars in the United States, hundreds of thousands of miles of paved road, and a highway department in every state. Society in that 20 years changed completely. In 1903, there were 55,000 harness makers in America, secure in their jobs. By 1923, there were 2,500 harness makers. What are we seeing today with newspapers and even automobile factories and steel mills and a host of other jobs that everybody thought were going to be there forever are fundamentally getting changed because the world is changing. The rules that are governing how we operate fundamentally are getting redefined, and it is being driven by globalization. Last week I was in Germany, in Wolfsburg, which is the headquarters for Volkswagen. And 20 years ago in Wolfsburg, Volkswagen has 60,000 employees there. 20 years ago, 3/4 of those employees were blue-collar workers. Today, 3/4 of those employees, of those 60,000 employees, are white-collar workers. The whole town needs the change. And Volkswagen asked a group of us to come to talk about how they changed their town from a blue-collar town to a white-collar town because they can't attract the talent they need. And the people making the robots are making the cars are robots now, not a lot of people. And so you can see right there a city that has been there for a lot of time, making a car that we all know about, is fundamentally trying to figure out its change. Environmental changes or technology innovation. You know, my son texts on average 5,000 times a month. How many of you do that? Anybody under 30 raises their hands, right? He only talks about 100 times 100 minutes a month. It is a whole different way. Technology is changing. Demographics and how we pay for the future, how we invest in what makes our cities successful. And the big change, the big challenge, the big chase for all of us is how do you attract talent to your town? How do you attract the people that are driving the economy? And let me just touch on demographics. People that look at me like me with gray hair. If you read, how many of you belong to AARP magazine? AARP? Go ahead, give it up. You can join at 50. You don't need to admit you're an old person. If you read the magazines from AARP, virtually every month or every other month in the magazines, there's articles about where boomers want to live. And they want to live in walkable and livable and affordable places that have a lot of vitality and arts and culture. That's where we want to live. We don't want to sit in a rocking chair and just sit there for our rest of our life. We want to be active. And I'm describing the places around here, aren't I? That you could be that place. And even more dramatic are the 83 million millennials, the people, our kids and our grandkids. They are making choices. A General Motors survey, an average 24-year-old is 6 times less likely to own an automobile than their parents did at that age. 6 times less likely, because it's not about cars anymore and sort of defining your status with a car, but it's about mobility, about how people move around, whether it's public transit like the trains you have, whether it's Uber, whether it's bicycles, whether it's walking. Our son, who is 28 years old now, doesn't even have a driver's license. And a lot of his friends don't, okay, because they use all the different means of transportation to move around, and that's how they shape their life. So if they want to live in Gary or want to live in Whiting or want to live in Hammond, how is the mobility there? How do they move around? Look, I went by some of the train stations. They're surface parking lots. Shame on you. That ought to be all housing there that I can get in, live there and roll out of bed and get on a train and be in downtown Chicago in 25 minutes. That's the kind of life that people want, and you have an opportunity to shape that here. And we'll talk about how that happens. So it's about being intentional, about looking at your assets. We all have different assets. You don't have warm weather all year, but you live on a great lake, right? And we don't have a great lake, but we live on 3 big rivers in Pittsburgh that we ignored for many, many years. And so how you use your assets in an intentional way to build the kind of community you want and that people will be a community of choice is a decision you make. It's a series of choices. This doesn't happen by accident. Some communities get it. This is a Loveland, Colorado that was a nowhere place 10 years ago, and if you go there today, you'll see $100 million worth of investment because they made a conscious decision that they wanted to be something other than they were. What do you need to do that? You need money, you need land control, you need sophisticated deal-making capacity, you need a vision, you need to know where you're going to go. You can't be just simply reacting to somebody coming in and say, Mayor, I have a great deal for you. You need to be able to say, with all due respect, tell me why it's a great deal for you. We'll decide whether it's a great deal for us, and if it makes sense, we'll figure out how to share the risk and make it happen. But that assumes you know what you want. What do you want Gary to be? What do you want Hammond to be? What do you want Whiting to be? You're starting with a great foundation. How do you put it together? And the key is about leadership. It's all about leadership, where that leadership comes from, and we'll talk about it. And these are just a few cities that I've had an opportunity to visit that have reimagined themselves. And they're big cities and small towns. I mean, I think the best small town in America is Charleston, South Carolina. Have any of you been there? It's a spectacular city. And Joe Riley, after Hurricane Hugo, and a 33-year-old became mayor, and people said, well, all these old buildings have been damaged by the hurricane, let's tear them down. And Joe said, no, sir, we're not tearing them down because historic preservation is going to be our trademark. And if you've been to Charleston, it's a remarkable example of how he used historic preservation to create a great place. Denver, if you've been to Denver lately, Denver made a decision. Denver said, we are destroying the whole reason we love Denver, the Front Range, the pollution, the commuting, the sprawl that is all going on. Let's build a mass transit system. And in 2004, the citizens of 3 counties came together and voted to tax themselves to build what they call the fast track transit, a 120-mile transit system. They weren't waiting for the federal government. They weren't waiting for the state government. That 3 counties made a decision. They wanted to reimagine what they look like as a region. And they built this transit. It's 120 miles. It's being built out of. It comes together at what was an old abandoned railroad station in downtown Denver, Union Station, with 20 acres around it. If you go there today, there's $2.5 billion worth of investment. It's a lively place. If you visit Denver, go to Union Station. It's a remarkable example all around that of the development that happened. And Greenville is a small community, smaller than all of your communities put together, probably less than 100,000 people. Greenville had a highway running right through the middle of it. They put a bridge over this waterfall, buried the bridge or the waterfall with a 4-lane bridge. This is what highway departments do, right? They put a 4-lane bridge over that waterfall, and then they widened a street right through the middle of Greenville to the 4 lanes. They narrowed the sidewalk, took out the parking. Sound familiar? And the mayor, about 15 years ago, and this has been in there for a long time, says, you know what, this is killing our town. I want to tear the bridge down and narrow the roads. And people said, there was lots of people yelling and saying, how are you going to do, we don't want you to do that. We won't be able to get through Greenville. And he says, that's the purpose. I don't want you to go through Greenville. I want you to stay here. And so he tore the bridge down. He narrowed the road from 4 lanes, no parking, to 2 lanes, 1 lane each way with parking, widened the sidewalks. If you go to Greenville today, you'll see hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment in downtown Greenville, a great performing arts center, lots of new offices, lots of cafes and restaurants, lots of new housing, a very lively place. That bridge and that highway was killing the city. It was sucking the vitality out of that city, and he put it back by getting rid of that bridge. It's a remarkable story. Charleston is a remarkable story. Cincinnati. This is an important lesson for all of you from businesses, the private sector. Cincinnati was a declining downtown. Companies like Procter & Gamble and Kroger's and other major companies have headquarters there, and they were beginning to think about moving out, frankly. And right next to downtown, directly across the street from the Kroger's headquarters, was Over the Rhine, a neighborhood that was described as the worst neighborhood in America. It was a high crime rate area. It had racial riots in the early 90s. It was a very difficult area. And the business community said, before we start all thinking about moving, let's try to do something. They partnered with the city. The business leadership raised $50 million in an investment fund. And about 10 years ago, they actually hired my economic development director when I was leaving as mayor. And over the last 10 years, he's been able to parlay that $50 million into about $1.5 billion of development. The downtown is incredibly lively if you've been to Cincinnati. If you go to Over the Rhine, it's really incredible. It was largely this, beautiful buildings, largely vacant. It's been established like this. Not only has he been successful at making it a place where millennials want to live, the 3CDC has built 3 homeless shelters. They've done hundreds of units of affordable housing in this neighborhood. So they didn't just simply drive people out, but they worked closely to not only build a community that would be for millennials, but would also be one that would take care of the residents that were there. And that brings me to Pittsburgh. I was mayor of Pittsburgh from 1994 to 2006. And I'd grown up in Pittsburgh all my life. And so I watched what happened. We went from the most economically depressed city in America and one of the most environmentally polluted city in my lifetime to now being ranked by The Economist and Forbes magazine as one of the most livable cities in America. How does that happen over 25 years? It happened because we built really strong partnerships. We had a vision about what we were going to do, and it wasn't that government did everything. The private market did something, the foundations did something. There was lots of different leadership places. But we made a decision to change. We were like you. We were the steel capital of America, and then we weren't. Between 70 and 90, we lost, as you can see, about 400,000 or 500,000 people left Pittsburgh, moved to Florida or Texas or other places, and we became the second oldest county in America. Dade County, Miami, is the oldest county. We weren't the second oldest because people were retiring to Pittsburgh. It was because our young people left. And it was a tragedy, not only in the loss of jobs, it was a tragedy in how it destroyed families and split families. And so I'm becoming mayor right at that tail end of that drop. And we make a very difficult decision that we're not going to manage decline anymore, that we're going to reimagine Pittsburgh and imagine what it means for Pittsburgh to grow. Well, that's a wonderful campaign slogan, isn't it? I mean, there were billboards in Pittsburgh at the time saying the last person out shut the lights off. You don't want that as your slogan, do you? And so we made some very controversial decisions that we needed money, we needed land control, we needed sophisticated deal-making capacity, and we needed to know where we were going to go. So I'm going to go to Gary and I'm going to go to Hammond, and they'd say they'd love to do this stuff, but they have no money, right, Mayor? And yet, I'm going to say to you, every city has money. Pittsburgh was flat broke. We were junk bond status, and our pension fund was 12% funded. I could worry about getting our bond up a couple points and getting our pension a little bit filled more, and I worried about that stuff. But at the end of the day, we were still going to be declining. So we made a very controversial decision. We moved $6 million out of our operating budget. It reduced the first couple months I was mayor, we reduced the city's workforce by 150 people, including police officers. And we shifted some of that money, $6 million a year, to finance a $60 million bond issue, which we called the Pittsburgh Development Fund. That was going to be our money to make investments in Pittsburgh's future. There's a fundamental decision every community makes. Do you spend all your resources on today with police and paving potholes and getting snow off the road, and obviously that all needs to be done, or do you take some of those resources to use it to invest in tomorrow? And that's a controversial decision. My budget people were saying, you can't take that $6 million. We ought to be putting it in the pension funds. And I said, but you know what? That doesn't solve fundamentally the issues we have. The second thing we did was we bought old steel mills. We bought, the first year I was mayor, 1,500 acres of property. We bought this steel mill, 140-acre steel mill. My father worked here for 51 years. You can imagine how emotional it was for me to now buy this steel mill that had been vacant and bankrupt for the last 20 years, sort of a symbol of our decline. We buy this steel mill, and now where there are 10,000 men and women made steel, including my father, there's a cheesecake factory. He would shoot me if he were alive. But this was a public-private partnership. We put in about $128 million of public money, and there's about $800 million of development altogether. There's thousands of new jobs and technology, and go to visit Southside Works when you're there. And there's retail, there's hundreds of units of housing. It fundamentally changed how we thought about our city as we developed it. But as you can see, it's a public-private partnership. There's probably 10 or 15 different sources of money. There's some federal money, there's some state money. We had money that we could make the deal happen. You can't get in the game if you have no money to put on the table. And so our development fund gave us the ability to do that and to partner with private developers. And so there's probably a dozen private developers on this particular parcel that we were able to partner with and share their risk. We had a vision about what this should be. We didn't want Walmart or big boxes. We wanted a more urban development. One of the large costs for public investment is that we built 4 parking garages here at a $20 to $25 million a pop, because we didn't want one store with a big surface parking lot around it. We wanted a dense store where people could park once and go to restaurants and go shopping and go to a movie theater and do whatever they want to do there. And so that's the vision that we had. It drove who our partners would be that were willing to work with that kind of idea. Let me just tell you this story. Imagine the worst place in one of your communities. This was East Liberty. It's where you're going to be staying, the 40 people that are going. And 60% of the property in East Liberty, when we start this, was tax delinquent. 60%. People had basically said, I'm walking away from this because there's no value to keep it, to be paying taxes in it. And so we buy an old Sears building that had been vacant for 10 years, 19 acres, and make a decision that we buy it as we're buying that 1,500 acres. We bought steel mills and buildings all over the city that we thought we could use to catalyze development in this area. We buy this old Sears building and we say to ourselves, what is going to bring both rich people and poor people to this neighborhood to shop? The 2 poorest neighborhoods of Pittsburgh on one side of this East Liberty, and the 2 richest neighborhoods on the other side. And we decided it was a Home Depot. And this is the middle 90s, and there are no urban Home Depots in America. We go to the real estate people at Home Depot and say, we'd like you to think about opening a store here, and they laughed at us and said, it's never where we're going to put a store. 5 miles from the nearest interstate in a gritty urban neighborhood. So I called up the mayor of Atlanta and said, tell me about the 2 guys that own Home Depot, and told me particularly about Bernie Marcus. He said, Bernie Marcus is really philanthropic. active in Atlanta, and he's also really active in national Jewish affairs. So I called up some of my friends in the Jewish community and said, could you invite Bernie Marcus up to Pittsburgh to speak? And a couple months later, he came, and a friend hosted him at a reception. This is a true story. My bodyguard, I had a bodyguard at the time. He was a police officer, and we walked up to Bernie Marcus, and he showed him his gun, and he said, we're kidnapping you. True story. And Bernie Marcus said, what's this about, right? And we said, you can make our dream come true if you come with us. And so he did. He came with us for a half hour. We drove out to this site and said, we want you to put a Home Depot there. And he said, you're crazy. And then by the end of the evening, he came up and said, we'll take a risk with you. You know, I got criticized for providing some subsidy to Home Depot. Home Depot opens. It's to this day, the highest sales volume of any store in the Pittsburgh market. So a young developer comes and has an option on an abandoned warehouse down a block or two from Home Depot. You'll see all this. And he said, I think I can get us in front of Whole Foods if you help us and work like you did Home Depot. And so we go to Austin and we talk to the Whole Foods people, and they agree to put a store in Pittsburgh. First Whole Foods store in the Pittsburgh market. From the year it opened, it was a Rookie of the Year store, meaning it had the highest sales volume per square foot, and it was also had the highest percentage of food stamps of any store in the country. So then that led to doing hundreds of units of housing, and it led to doing some restaurants started to show up there. We did these housing. And then Google was over at Carnegie Mellon University doing some research. There were two people there 10 years ago working jointly on something we call artificial intelligence. And Google kept growing. And there was this big old Nabisco bakery building in East Liberty that had been sitting there vacant for 15 or 20 years. And Google finally got to a point that said, we need to get off the CMU campus and open our own place. So you're going to go see this in Bakery Square, we call it. There is now 700 Google people there. So what's the relationship between Home Depot and Google? The relationship is that we created a neighborhood in a very intentional way that has vitality and excitement. And it's all done through public-private partnerships. So Nabisco there is now, that old Nabisco bakery is now Google in an incredibly vibrant and houses and condos, and it's pretty remarkable. And then downtown Pittsburgh was, as you can imagine, suffering greatly. We were a 9-to-5 city. Nobody wanted to stay much after 5 o'clock in downtown. You see that big, that sort of box area with the blue line around it. That's what we call our cultural trust district. It was our really red light district 20 years ago. There were 22 massage parlors and strip joints in that area. There's only one strip joint now. I mean, maybe every city needs one, right? But that area, this is what I mean by leadership, not. So the foundations, particularly the Heinz Endowment, came to us and said, I think we can make that into a cultural district. There were two big vaudeville theaters there. One was a strip joint, and the other was vacant. And now, if you come to Pittsburgh, you will see the Cultural Trust. There are 12 performance venues and 1,500 legitimate performances a year going on. The ballets there, the symphony, the theater, several movie theaters. 2 million people a year come there to enjoy culture and the arts. We work with the school board to build the performing arts middle school and high school there. Our son went there, and he would come home, and the symphony, the ballet, the theater, if they hadn't sold out, would ship their tickets over to the performing arts high school. And my son would come and say, Dad, I need $20, want to stay downtown for dinner and go to the symphony. Don't you want your kid to live like that? That have that sense of what it means to live like that. And so the city was supporting characters in that effort. It was really the leadership and the vision came from the foundation. So when you come to Pittsburgh, you want to know about that cultural trust and the power that culture and the arts can have in shaping a city and the vitality of that city. And then across the river, we built a baseball park and a football stadium, which I'll talk about. But when if you want to go to a baseball game or a football game, we built parking garages over there, and it cost you $40 during a game to park over there. But if you want to park downtown in the Cultural Trust District where we have some garages, it will only cost you $5. So 10,000 people going to a baseball game, park downtown, and we shut a bridge down, and we put a band on the bridge, and people like to walk across the bridge. And it creates, so what is the connection between baseball and the symphony? It again brings people together. It creates vitality. So there's a strategy and a vision about this that connects things that are sort of seemingly unconnected that you need to think about in a city. So this is our cultural trust history. Great public spaces, great performances there. And then we had these rivers. 3 rivers, and when I was growing up in Pittsburgh, my mother would always say to me 2 things when we were going out to play. Be home before the streetlights come on, and she would say, never go near those rivers. If you go in those rivers, she would say, you're going to melt because they were so polluted, okay? And it's not that way anymore. That's the Ducky. Was the Ducky in Chicago too? So this is a huge Ducky. It was like I don't know, it was hundreds of thousands of people went down to look at this thing floating in our river. And you can see the boats. And now, when I became mayor, we had less than a mile of public access to our riverfronts. And now we have 30 miles of public park continuously in Pittsburgh. And I can ride a bike from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. and never go on a road. Through the most industrialized place in America, I can now ride a bike from Pittsburgh to Washington. It takes about 5 days. So I don't do it regularly. I've done it several times. It is a great ride through history and scenery. And I'm telling you this stuff because you have a remarkable waterfront. I want to say riverfront, lakefront, okay? You have Dunes National Park, which is one of the really most visited places. And I don't know if anybody's paying attention to it here, in terms of how you, not individually, and Leah took me to some parks in Whiting and Hammond, and some of the parks, and Gary, some of the parks that have been built that are really great. How you think about using those as an asset and connecting them, not thinking them individually, but connecting them creates huge value for you. People will come here. There's a whole economy now on this Pittsburgh to Washington trail, and the small towns, and lots of bed and breakfasts and everything that cater to the thousands of people riding that all the time. And any of you are architects or planners? Raise your hand. So what were you all smoking and drinking in the 60s and 70s? So all over America, they built these big concrete things, whether ballparks or buildings. And look at the highest and best use of this. The highest and best use of this property right across the street across the river from a great city is a surface parking lot with a road along the river. Not even any good access to the river. So the Steelers lost the Super Bowl, we blew it up. And we built a new football stadium, Heinz Field, and we built the best baseball park in America by pretty much everybody's measure, and right on the river. And we built a new convention center. When it was opened, it was the largest certified green building in America. And again, that happens, I don't know, in the mid-60s, or mid-90s, I don't know what green means. And we all do now, but back then it wasn't as common. And the foundations came and said, we'll fund an international design competition if you will agree to make the building green. And we did, and I'm glad we did. And that's that riverfront now. We took the road off the river. We opened up the river. We put a park along there. We created spaces for new development. There's $1.5 billion of development in those parking lots around where Three Rivers Stadium was. And then one of the big challenges that we had in Pittsburgh, and every city has, and I'm sure that Gary and Hammond have it, is that 12% of our population lived in public housing. So 32,000 people and 17,000 units lived in public housing, and it was the worst housing in Pittsburgh. It isolated people. It narrowed people's options of where they could work. And so we made it a fundamental decision that people in public housing need to be part of the Pittsburgh conversation. I made myself chairman of the Public Housing Authority, and I'm told I'm the only mayor in America that ever did that, and after 6 years of doing it, I know why. because public housing is a huge challenge, but it is an important challenge for every city of how you connect as we began to create jobs, whether in Home Depot or PNC Bank. How do you connect jobs? And this was one of our public housing. It was built in 1939 and nothing changed. It looked the same. It was barracks. It had been built as temporary housing and people had lived there for 3 generations. So we tore it down. The tenants were initially upset, and then they actually ended up naming a building after me. And we built a mixed income community of both some housing for the older people, but townhouses. And it's right up against the University of Pittsburgh. And now you end up with people on public assistance living there and students living there from the university or professors. So it changed the whole dynamic of this community. And you all know what this is, right? It's slag. You know what slag is. So our steel mills dumped slag here for 90 years. It looked like the moon. It's 250 acres. That's what it looked like. And we made a decision to buy that. People thought we were crazy. And it's right up against one of the nicest neighborhoods of Pittsburgh. And we bought that, and we worked with private developers in partnership again. We worked with the foundations to help us think it through, and that's what it was dumped there all these years, slag. And now there's 700 new homes there. Some of them selling for upwards of $1 million. The first new housing development in Pittsburgh in 50 years. None of us knew whether there'd be a market for new housing. It has been the most successful development, outperforming all the suburban developments in the whole region. People wanted to live in the city. They just didn't want to buy an old house. They wanted a new house. And so we ended up we thought it would just be empty nesters and young professionals. We ended up having to put a swimming pool and playgrounds in because so many young families moved back to the city. I mentioned the riverfront parks. It changed who we were. We turned our backs on the riverfronts, and now we use the riverfronts. So you're going to say, how did you, I want you to understand this. We were the flattest broke city in America. I mean, we were broke, but we found the money to do this because there's money to do it. You ought to be creative about it. The banks need to be good partners with us in it. And so we all agreed in the county to raise the sales tax 0.5% to invest in what we called regional assets, in our parks, in the libraries. This is when we are at a 20% unemployment rate. The citizens agree to raise the tax because in the zoo, in the stadiums, these were investments that we made as a community. We worked hard to get venture capital. I was talking to some people early. We were a city that had so our economy, as our steel industry went away, we were big unions, big corporations, there was not much of an entrepreneurial culture. And we made a decision, large part because Dr. Sarad, who was president of Carnegie Mellon University, said we can be the economic drivers of the region. And we made a decision to figure out how to create an entrepreneurial culture. And we worked very hard to do that, to build the availability of venture capital and early stage financing and incubators and mentors and a whole entrepreneurial culture. And you can see the results over the last 5 or 6 years. We're averaging about anywhere from 30 to 40 startup companies a year that are now locating in Pittsburgh. So after a few years, we have hundreds of startup companies growing in Pittsburgh that are fundamentally redefining our economy. And in large part, that's been driven by the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon that are getting large amounts of research. So often I go to cities, though, they get money for research, and you don't see results. If I say to you, what city in America gets more research dollars than any other, what would you say? You'd say maybe California someplace or Boston. Well, it's Baltimore. Baltimore, Johns Hopkins gets $1.8 billion a year, and the University of Maryland professional schools get about $400 or $500 million in Baltimore, and there's no evidence of a technology economy in Baltimore. Baltimore should be the Silicon East, but they're not because they've not worked as a community in a partnership to create an entrepreneurial culture. I'm looking at the president of the university over here, and I talked to the Purdue people. You have the opportunity to be part of the economic drive of this, but you need to think about how you create not just your school, but how you create that entrepreneurial culture here. We've invested in education. You were probably the same way. If you look at in 1960, the 100 largest cities in America, we were dead last in the percent of our population with high school degrees. Today, we're third. And one of the things we've done is if you go to a Pittsburgh public school and you have a B average and good attendance, you get a $30,000 scholarship to go to any university, trade school, professional school you want after you graduate. Is that an incentive? I know people that buy a condo in Pittsburgh to have a Pittsburgh address so their kids can get this. We did lots of financing. We did what is called tax increment financing. I won't bore you with it, but cities, I don't know the laws in Indiana, but cities have the capacity to capture the value that they're going to create from new developments and use some of that revenue to fund the necessary infrastructure that permits that development to happen. So we did $338 million worth of tax increment financing deals that have generated $3.5 billion worth of development in Pittsburgh. So that's a great return. And so the question is, do you think about just today? Or do you think about tomorrow? And so when you say we don't have any money, you say you don't have any money for tomorrow. You have to have money for tomorrow. So the pieces of the puzzle, know what you want, find the leadership, both public and private, build the partnership, understand you need to go after the talent, and then you need to build great places, not mediocre places. And I'm going to end on this. How many of you, if I say General Electric, and McDonald's, and Caterpillar, and Motorola, and Fifth Third Bank, and Heinz Crafts Foods, and Google now, and a host of other companies, what do they all have in common? You need to know this. They all have in common in the last 3 years they moved their headquarters from suburban office parks into cities. So General Electric moved from a 72-acre campus in suburban Connecticut with hundreds of thousands of surface parking spaces to downtown Boston with no parking spaces. McDonald's is moving their campus out of suburban Chicago. You have a choice. There's one choice. You have assets here. You can find the money. It's never about any of that stuff. I've been to hundreds of meetings where people will always give you a reason why you can't do something. It costs too much, it's the wrong place, it's too big, it's too small. At the end of the day, it's about none of that stuff. It's about one thing. It's about whether you have the community and political will to kick the door down to reach for the future. That's your choice. You have 630 people here today. If you all kick that door down together, you get to the future. You got to take those risks. If you don't take those risks, you'll never get there. Good luck.
That was really wonderful and very enlightening. And I'm sure there were moments when we all thought, we could be doing that. So I wanted to take some time to just thank everyone again for joining us. And I also want to thank those of you who have joined the Northwest Indiana Regional Opportunities Council. It was a new idea and a new thought, and so I appreciate all of you for taking a chance and joining like-minded colleagues and coming together to move our region forward, so thank you. And we've talked a lot about this council, which is private sector and institutions, but I also want to note that the public sector is critical in moving our region forward, and it takes the public-private partnerships to do exactly that. I know we have many elected officials in the room and staff of municipalities in the public sector, and so I thank you for your work and dedication to the region, and I look forward to having more public-private partnerships and relationships. In fact, my colleague, Dr. Vanessa Allen McLeod, who is the president and CEO of Urban League Northwest Indiana, she and I were recently on a phone call with the president of Urban League in Pittsburgh, planning for One Region's visit to Pittsburgh. And the president of Urban League in Pittsburgh said, partnerships are the new leadership. And I think that's right. So the more we work together, the more we face conflict head on, the more we collaborate, and I mean true collaboration, we will move our region forward and we will create that vitality. I also want to note that there are places in this region that are thriving, and it's all over. We have places that are growing. overall, we have more work to do. So I appreciate what everyone is doing. Everyone is lending a helping hand. It's incredible that this room has 630 people in it. So thank you for taking the time to come. If you're interested in joining One Region and what we're working to create, you can talk to me about joining the council, or you can talk about creative partnerships. We are looking to work with others. We're not looking to reinvent the wheel or duplicate efforts, as Ben said. This is all hands on deck and requires partnerships. So thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy this beautiful day, and I look forward to working with you.